Their choir has sung for presidents and world leaders, had an audience with Her Majesty the Queen, and inspired hope all over the world for decades. But that is just part of the story. The impact of this multifaceted ministry started with two people saying yes to God's assignment for their lives almost 40 years ago, and they join me here today. All the way from Watoto Church in Kampala, Uganda, welcome back to 100 Huntley Street, Gary and Marilyn Skinner.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's so good to have you here. I will never forget the impression that one of the iterations of Watoto Choir, because you said you've sent out almost 150 choirs over the years, had on me as a youngster at a church that I was ministering in music at a number of years ago, when they came and just filled the sanctuary with joy and music and laughter and love. Take us back to 84. It doesn't matter, Gary, Marilyn, whomever wants to answer. This is just a great conversation we're going to have about this wonderful ministry. Take us back to 1984.
Go ahead.
You want me to go ahead? Okay.
Ladies first.
Well, you know, God spoke to Gary, and he said, Gary, I want you to move to Kampala, Uganda. I want you to start a church downtown in the heart of the city, and through that church, I'll touch this city and I'll touch the nation. So it was 1983. We were just a young couple. We had 3 little kids, 4, 6, and 8, when we moved with our children to Uganda. And I've got to tell you, Mark, Uganda was not a country people were running to back then. Mm-hmm. It was a country everybody was running away from because it was so dangerous. We were in the middle of civil war. Idi Amin had just been chased out. 500,000 people had been murdered. We heard gunfire every single night, sometimes across the city, sometimes across the street, sometimes right in our front yard. Many times, you know, I could keep you here all day telling you stories of how God's supernatural, divine protection preserved our life. But, you know, I believe that God still speaks to people today. He didn't just speak to Noah and say, hey, boy, it's going to rain, build me an ark. He didn't just speak to Moses and say, hey, I got a job for you to do. God has a God assignment for every one of us, and our assignment was Uganda.
Amazing. Okay, so right in the middle of civil war, and you talk about, yes, hearing gunfire every night, and I've heard you tell stories, Marilyn, about, you know, people coming to break down a wooden door that you said you could have broken down, yeah, but God protected you. Gary, taking your family, this young family from Canada, the sort of the safety and security of this nation, and going to a country like that during what they were experiencing in terms of a, you know, civil war and the dangers there. You know, some people would say, what were you thinking? What were you thinking?
Well, you know, Mark, I do believe that God speaks to people and asks them to lay down their lives for the cause of the kingdom. Mm. And if you look at missions over the centuries, even Uganda, the first missionaries, the first 8 missionaries that went, 7 of them died within 2 years. They went without their families, but they saw a revival that literally transformed Uganda from a heathen nation that was dominated by witchcraft, slavery, ritual murder, child sacrifice, to become a nation that Winston Churchill called the Pearl of Africa. Mm. And the revival changed the nation forever. It doesn't come about without sacrifice. So God calls some people to, well, he calls us all to sacrifice, but some to extreme sacrifice. So when he asked me to do it, it was just what I knew he wanted us to do in order to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish in Uganda. So it's not a smart thing to do, but it's a God thing to do.
It's a God thing to do.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's interesting from the West, we can look at the continent of Africa and kind of lump everyone in together and think that all the countries that make up that continent are the same. But what makes Uganda unique, even to this day? What is so special about Uganda, especially to you and to the continent as a whole?
Uganda is a nation that experienced unbelievable revival in the early 1900s, into the 1800s. It was an advanced African state. I was reading recently that probably they may have had Egyptian or Ethiopian influence that caused them their king to have a certain kind of federal system. It was very well organized and so on. But it's very much witchcraft. They had a strong monarchical system. When the missionaries came, and the gospel and Christ replaced all of that, it literally transformed the nation. I think that Africa not just Uganda, but Africa is open to spiritual things. In the West, demons are not real, angels we're not sure about, God doesn't exist. But in Africa, you never argue with an African about the existence of God or spiritual reality. So there is an openness to spiritual things. And I think that's what makes Africans sometimes a little bit different in terms of spiritual reality. And if you go to Africa, the church is alive. And young people are pouring into churches. Yeah, it's very exciting.
Very exciting. And there's so many facets to your story, and I really want to get to the story of Watoto, because God takes you to Uganda to start a church in Kampala.
Yeah.
And Watoto, first of all, maybe let our viewers know what the meaning of the word is. What language is it from? Because there are a number of languages of Uganda. And talk to us about all the facets of the ministry. What does it encompass? Because it's not just a touring choir. They come from a massive congregation.
Yeah. We have about 40,000 people coming to church in about 16 different campuses on a Sunday. But at the core of what we do is we say Watoto Church, celebrate Christ, care for community. And God began to show me that the church is not there just to have meetings on Sunday to make people feel good. We're there to inspire and challenge the people to become transformational agents where they live in the community. So whatever the problems of the community are, they're not the government's problems or even the people's problems, they're God's problems, because God owns the community. And he asks, if it's his problems, then he gives those problems to his people, the church. So any problem that we face in society, and ours was orphans, God says, I want you to look after the orphans. That's how it came about. And God also very clearly put it in our hearts that it wasn't about rescuing just orphans. It was about raising leaders. And it wasn't just about raising leaders, it was about rebuilding a nation. So that vision became a part of who we are as Watoto. Out of that, as we were caring for the children, God said, put the children together in a choir, take them around the world, and don't tell a sad story, tell a glad story. It's a story of transformation and hope. That's why the kids are beautifully dressed. And we want them to see the potential in these kids. God takes the least to do something significant. And these kids are going to go on to do significant with their lives. Not because they're disadvantaged, but God has a special place in his heart for those that were marginalized and set aside by the rest of society. God takes the weak things to do significant things. And that's what we're going to see in Africa as well. We're going to see the emergence in a more and more secular world that turns from God. We're going to see the demise of the Western secular, because you can't live with lies all your life. Eventually truth will rise again. And that's what we're seeing in Africa. Africa is going to change because it is a nation that is turning to God and beginning to experience transformation nationally. Our dream, raise up, this is what God said to me, raise up for me the next generation of Ugandan and African leaders. So we have a multi-generational vision to see the transformation of a nation, a city, and a continent by reaching the least and the lost and the lonely and the poor.
And that you have done with great impact in the nation and taken the message around the world. I'm sure it may be hard to even just nail down one thing, but Marilyn, I want to ask you, over the 40 years, what has been perhaps your greatest joy? And juxtaposed against that, maybe what has been your greatest challenge?
I think my greatest joy has been when we arrived in Uganda. It was a country of hopelessness. Everywhere you looked, I'll never forget the haunting eyes. There was no hope, just empty stares. But today, you've seen the children. Yeah. They are full of hope. They're full of purpose. They're full of a future. And so I think my greatest joy has been seeing the transformation, like Gary said, of the least of these. Seeing God, seeing Jesus make something out of nothing. There's many on the other side of the coin. It's costly.
Right.
It's costly if you want to be a disciple of Jesus. I learned a long time ago there's a big difference between being a follower of Jesus and being a disciple of Jesus. And being a follower of Jesus, you just have to believe in your heart and confess with your mouth. But to be a disciple, you have to take the things that are dearest and best to you, whether plans or people, and you have to kiss them goodbye. Yeah. That means your mother, your father, your brother, your sister, even your own children. You know, Uganda was so dangerous, we had to send our 3 children away to boarding school. That probably was the most difficult, the most heavy cross that we had to bear. But you know, we do it with joy.
Yeah.
We do it with joy because when God speaks to you, you know, actually obedience is better than sacrifice.
Yes.
And you know, I'm encouraged. The book of Ecclesiastes, I find the most frustrating book in the Bible because here's a man who's had it all. And at the end of his life, he says, what was it for? But, you know, the last verse in Ecclesiastes, Solomon says something that I've tried to live my life by, and I think it's so important. He says, out of all my life, this is the 2 most important things: fear God and do what he says. And when you make a decision in your heart to fear God and do what he says, you're going to have joys, but you're also going to have mountains that you got to climb over. But you know what? He's the God of the mountains and he's the God of the valley.
He is, and yeah, that whole message of fear is not one that's particularly popular, especially in the Western world. No. You know, we don't want anything that's going to cost us something, and you two have exemplified really laying down your lives and your own desires for the cause of Christ. And with time, they became your desires, became your heart and your passion.
Absolutely.
After 40 years, you were turning over the mantle of leadership to a couple that have come up through Watoto Ministries. Pastor Julius and Vernita Rotlonyo. How did I do with that?
Very good, very good.
And I had the privilege of watching online. I wasn't there in person. I wish I was, but watching the beautiful commissioning service where you turned over that mantle of ministry to them. How does that feel?
It feels very rewarding to come to the end of our official ministry and see that our greatest success is not just a big church, but to see a generation of young leaders rising up and taking the responsibility of bringing the hope of Christ and the hope of the gospel to a nation. Very rewarding. So for the rest of our lives, all we want to do is serve that leadership as parents, come alongside our spiritual sons and daughters and pat them on the back and advise them and encourage them. I mean, when we went, it was so hard. Here we are at the end, and we are the most blessed people on the planet.
Amazing.
That's how it feels.
That's how it feels.
Blessed. Every day we say, oh God, you could have chosen anyone else. Thank you for giving us the privilege. I don't think there's anyone more blessed in the world than we are.
Yeah.
You know, transitions aren't easy. And transitions often are messy. That has not been our story.
Not at all.
Our story has been one of great joy, great reward.
Will you continue to be involved? Will you continue to live in Kampala? Will you?
Yeah.
What are the plans for the future?
I think we'll continue to live in Uganda during the Canadian winter months. Even the birds.
Smart. Good choice.
Even the birds fly south. But also serve the church in any way that they would like us to serve. But we can travel from there. We can travel from here. We've learned so much. We've experienced so much. We just want to spend these last years of our lives serving the next generation, coming alongside the young pastors here and around the world who are facing a very difficult, different, dangerous, dark world, and say, don't give up. The best is still ahead for you. God is the same as he was yesterday and will always be. He is the owner. He's the final authority over all of life. God raised Jesus from death, set him on a throne in deep heaven, in charge of running the universe, everything from galaxies to governments. No name, no rule, no power exempt from that rule, not just for the time being, but forever. At the center of all this, Christ rules the church. The church is not peripheral to the world is peripheral to the church. The church is Christ's body through which he speaks and acts, through which he fills all things with his presence. The church at the core of society is the hope of society. If you're in a church, give your best. If you're a pastor, give your best, because the church will never fail. There's a God in heaven who created it. Lots of things come and go. Communism comes and goes. Lots of things come and go. But what remains? truth remains. At the heart of it is this amazing person who is truth. His name is Jesus. He's the hope of individuals. He's the hope of cities. He's the hope of nations. And he plants us as the church to be salt and light and bring about transformation in our communities. We've seen that in Uganda. He wants to do it anywhere.
Well, that is an amazing note to end on, Gary. Marilyn, thank you so much for being with us. You are just shining examples of what it means to live fearless lives for Christ, just completely abandoned to his calling on your life. You know, we used to sing a song in church that says, if you can use anything, Lord, you can use me. Perhaps you know the song, and you certainly have lived that out. It's such an honor to have you here. Exciting to see what God has in store for Watoto in the future and your lives and your continued involvement there. And thanks for taking a couple minutes to be with us today and just share with us.
Bless you.
God bless you.